fair to say the topic of APP fraud and scams is particularly relevant at the moment. I'd say in the UK, but actually we've got a few people that have registered from other parts of the world as well. So clearly it's something that's resonating outside of the UK too. So first and foremost, we're just going to start off with a little bit of housekeeping. So any questions, feel free to use the Q&A function included within Zoom. What we'll do is I'll either attempt to ask the questions or answer the questions as we go along, or we'll, depending on time, pick up following. So obviously we'll contact you via email or whatever. We'll also be recording the session, so anybody that couldn't make it or anybody that is looking to kind of distribute this within their organization, etc., we'll make sure that we provide that post the session. So without further ado, we'll go into some introductions. So let me just start off with you, Chris. If you could introduce who you are, what you do within NatWest, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So as is obvious from the slide, Chris Parker, Fraud Analytics Product and Threat Lead. I've been at NatWest, I think it's going to be 21 or possibly even 22 years as of this September. So I have worked in a number of customer-facing areas, but then over the last sort of 15 years have been at the coalface of evolving malware attacks, phishing attacks, and now the sort of authorized push payments that we're dealing with. So my day-to-day at the minute is one of kind of wearing two hats. I'm a product owner for our infrastructure, data and authentication chapter, which is essentially a combined sort of transformation team who are looking to address sort of our infrastructure requirements, how we better use data, and how we better sort of authenticate customers and try to reduce losses. I also manage a number of the contracts that with third parties looks to enrich the data that we hold internally to be able to make better decisions and prevent some of the fraud and scams that we see. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Obviously, the threat management piece is very kind of key to that also, but that's me at the minute.
Cheers, Chris. So I'll pick up there. I'm going to do my utmost here not to turn this into a Prove sales session, but I will have to do an introduction to Prove just so we can set the scene. But my responsibility within Prove is fundamentally the UK and part of our global expansion. So I'll explain a little bit more about Prove in a second, but I've been here now for a couple of years. Prior to that, I was within the GSMA. I worked with BT within their digital identity division. And I've also worked in a number of vendors that have looked at, in particular, data associated to mobile and understanding different insights that can help deliver trust and confidence, in particular around transactions, onboarding, those types of things. But let me do the obligatory intro to Prove. So very straightforward proposition, which hopefully will help kind of set the scene in terms of some of the APP and scam work that we're doing. So our premise is very much centered on the concept of the phone being a method of proving identity. So if you consider that, I think current stats in the UK suggest that you get your first mobile at the age of 11. At that point, you're establishing a set of patterns of behavior, a tenure of trust, and a confidence that fundamentally you can leverage for a number of different use cases. And so we've been operational now for over 10 years. We provide services to, as it says there, kind of 8 of the top 10 banks. That's actually in the US. In the UK, we provide services to NatWest and others, fundamentally around this concept of leveraging the phone to deliver trust and actually fundamentally remove the friction. So just going from that, and this is where we'll start bleeding into some of the APP work. So that concept then is based on 3 pillars. So if you look at what we utilize as a method of determining kind of trust and confidence, we utilize an acronym called PRO. So the P of PRO incidentally, is something that we focus on in terms of delivering possession. So this could be anything from SMS OTP through to, depending on what the industry call it currently, instant auth, mobile auth, number verify. But fundamentally, it's a way of determining possession that's PSD2 compliant, that removes the difficulties around things like social engineering. So as much as today's discussion is not specifically talking around this, it is relevant because actually it's another way of removing that challenge around fundamentally the human and the human step as part of kind of authentication and identity proofing. The second element of Pro is our reputational element. So we leverage what we call our trust score. This is where we start to talk more and more around data attributes, which we'll touch on today. But fundamentally, what we're doing is we're using a ubiquitous model to determine the confidence around a phone number as a measure or a method to kind of deliver that trust from an onboarding or even from a transactional point of view. And then the final step is around ownership, which if you think of it as being, let's use PSD2 as an example, having the confidence around a phone number and the ownership of a particular phone number is critical. Because as you're delivering more and more, whether it be SMS or voice or even other methods of authentication, you need to be confident that that number is in the ownership of that individual at that given time. So these then combined provide an incredibly kind of solid method or solution that enables you to kind of get confidence around the number. From this is where the APP work started. So if we move on to the next slide now in terms of kind of APP. So I'm really cognizant here of not teaching people to suck eggs because I'm assuming that probably most people on the call know more about this than I do. But just to set the scene for any that, that don't know a great deal about this. So in fact, let me just go back a step. So delivering certain capabilities in the UK has enabled us to kind of get ahead of the game in terms of innovation and looking at different ways of fundamentally providing the confidence and trust around the number. That was the leap basically into this world of APP and scams. So if you look at this on its basic level, it's a method of socially engineering individuals to authorize payments to others. And so fundamentally sending, for example, cash from one bank account to, say, a fraudster's bank account. On a personal level, this is particularly relevant because, I mean, I get calls from my dad all the time saying that he gets weird and wonderful phone calls and texts asking him to send details, asking him to send information. And what we're in the process of doing is looking at different ways of mitigating that from a technology standpoint. Just on this, and I'm wondering, Chris, can I just bring you in at this point? So obviously there's a multitude of different scams that kind of underpin this idea of authorized push payments. Are there any that you would regard as being kind of most prevalent, even on a market basis, as opposed to it being just NatWest?
Definitely, yes. I think if you look at, so most of the UK banks are members of the kind of CRM, so the contingent reimbursement model, which has looked really to try to manage APPs better. So there are, I think, 8 different classifications of authorized push payment, which I won't remember all of them. But I think amongst those, I mean, we definitely have a few that, whether it's from a volume point of view or a value point of view, are particularly pointy within industry. So you've got romance scams, which tend not to happen en masse, but certainly where they do, the social engineering, the hook, is quite persistent and can lead to individuals losing quite a lot of money. You have purchase scams where probably the volume is higher, the value maybe a little bit lower. But again, it's very easy now with various different social media marketplaces to sort of trick somebody into buying something that doesn't materialize. Impersonation scams are massive. It's classified actually as 2 different types. You've got impersonation of bank or police, and then you've got impersonation other. Both of those, I think one of them in the kind of fraud the facts 2021, which would have been 2020's kind of cases, saw, I think the 2 impersonation flavors saw over 90% increase in terms of volume. Impersonation other was a 7% increase in value, which took it to about 53.7 million. And the impersonation of police or bank staff was up 15% to 96.6 million. So, impersonation combined is a really meaty number. And the other one is investment scams. So probably at a volume that is uncomfortable, but certainly a value that is uncomfortable, because a lot of the time individuals will be coerced sometimes through an impersonation call that's sort of linked, but more often through maybe search results or advertisements or other hooks that kind of hone them in on a possible investment opportunity, be it kind of Bitcoin or cryptocurrency or even kind of traditional investments. And a lot of money can be invested and ultimately lost. So that one, the value is particularly sort of high and painful. So I would say of those, three really, I suppose you could break the two impersonation down, but yeah, impersonation, romance, and investment scams are probably the pointy ones that we have at the minute.
So it's fair to say then that from your perspective, in terms of delivering trust, it's not about just being able to trust the consumer and the end user, but actually the consumer and the end user being able to trust where the communications and various else, has come from. So, for example, if somebody's impersonating the bank, how can you establish confidence in that so that they know they're dealing with the right entity, if you like?
Yeah. And there's a lot of, I think across the industry and certainly within NatWest, we've really wanted for a long time and has struggled really to get a true sort of state of mutual authentication. So everybody would have had a phone call from a bank or another entity who is required to identify you to a certain level before they can discuss an issue with your account or booking at a hotel or whatever else. But they're typically asking you for personal information that sometimes is quite sensitive as well, prior to you knowing who they are. So kind of, I guess we've dealt with various different manifestations of the kind of challenges there. So things like call spoofing. So NatWest is kind of, I don't know whether I'd say we'd led industry, but certainly we've been hugely committed to utilizing the Ofcom do not originate capabilities. So a couple of years ago, we saw fraudsters spoofing our general sort of help desk lines, which are now all inbound only. We no longer make any outbound calls from those same numbers, which means fraudsters also cannot make calls to our customers from our phone numbers. It has an impact in terms of, ironically, less customers will now answer the phone when we genuinely call them because they don't have confidence that it is us because their number isn't present. But the harm is much greater than the gain. So we've sort of taken a conscious decision to step through that. Things like SMS, we, as many other banks did, really found SMS a great, almost ubiquitous communication method with our customers. And it was used for one-time passcodes. It was used to verify certain activities. It was used for kind of general interaction. Again, the headers, so the kind of from part of that message, if you like, is all too readily spoofable. And again, fraudsters took that opportunity, spoofed our headers. So we utilized some industry solutions to prevent that spoofing, which again has been really successful. But in both the phone and the call instances, fraudsters will now do something that looks a bit like us, or they just don't pretend to look like us at all, and they can still hook customers. So we've done as much as we can to stop the, if you like, elegant impersonation of the bank, but we still yet haven't got a true verifiable way to say, it is us if we demonstrate X, Y, Z. We're sort of stepping through that. We're looking at how we can use things like through app phone calls. So a customer would be phoned via their trusted banking app, or they can engage with us through that banking app. And that's landing relatively soon within our wealth brands and hopefully this year within our retail kind of customer base as well. But then, when you step outside of NatWest and you're looking at investment firms, crypto exchanges, again, how a customer knows that the firm themselves are legit or the activity they're going through is legitimate, again, is a real challenge. The FCA are looking to do what they can in terms of sort of verified sort of providers of services, but there still remains a sort of unknown, this lack of certainty, I suppose, with customers with whom they're engaging with. But definitely it's the sort of thing where we're looking for, ways in which we can be more confident and also customers can be more confident.
I think I seem to remember a conversation we had in the past around things like RCS as well, where you've got that kind of verified sender branding, creating almost like a secure channel that replicates SMS, but obviously in a kind of richer vein. There's a lot of kind of things happening, but it's getting that kind of ubiquitous solution out there, isn't it? I guess so that people can be confident and wary of it.
And I think we find that there's a lot of solutions that technically are, say, non-spoofable and absolutely verifiable, but until you move everything lock, stock, and barrel onto that new thing, you can't say, if we were to contact you in any other way, don't trust it, because there will always be pockets that we're kind of migrating. And as with RCS, its biggest issue is the fact that Apple, in their eternal wisdom, is refusing to adopt it at this point in time. So, you've already got sort of a split between our customers, those who are on iOS versus those on Android, and how do you kind of manage that? But yeah, things are evolving, and mostly for the better.
Good. And we'll touch on a bit of that later in terms of the collaboration. But if we just move on to the next slide in terms of the size of the problem. So I think, people on this call, again, there's probably a vast majority have seen some of the numbers, and obviously they'll be aware of the challenges within their own bank or the market generally. There was one that came out, I think it was last week or the week before, where it kind of focused on one particular number, which I just want to call on here, which was the kind of £28,000 lost per hour by individuals around scams. I think that kind of, for me, hits home, particularly when you start looking at, average salaries and things like that. It really gives a view as to the size of the challenge. Just as an additional point that's not necessarily on the slide, so I believe UK Finance, I think there's the next kind of tranche of numbers that are going to come out soon. So we'll get an indication as to, the direction of the size of the problem and whether it continues to grow. I'm going to ask you a question here, Chris, that you can quite happily just say, I'm not answering that. But is it fair to say that ahead of those numbers going out, from a market perspective, the feeling is it's still a kind of growing issue? And have you got kind of top of mind any thoughts, kind of year on year growth over the last 2 or 3 years?
I mean, I would suspect things will probably be worse than they were in 2020. I would hope to see that the rate of acceleration has dropped significantly. I actually don't know whether that's going to be the case or not. I mean, I think for ourselves, with obviously over the last couple of years, there's been a number of things that have sort of played into the fraudsters' hands. So I think probably going back to sort of 2019 was probably the point where most banks in the UK had got pretty good at detecting unauthorized third-party frauds. So the use of sort of device profiling, transactional profiling, and so on. And that sort of forced fraudsters into adopting some of the APP sort of scam moduses. So essentially, where rather than trying to steal customer credentials and then log in and look like them, actually you just convince the customer to do it themselves. And then as a bank, our in-place kind of detective capability, we were seeing the customer on their device using their authentication. And even in all too many cases, we were alerting and the customer was speaking to us and had been coached to say, this is genuine. I'm paying a family member. I'm, doing whatever. Obviously, things like the pandemic have played a massive part. So people being at home, isolated, where maybe if they were in a more kind of maybe not public setting, but kind of a group setting, they would perhaps be less vulnerable. Issues with people's sort of employment status, whether on furlough or lost their jobs or whatever else, everybody was impacted in some way, and that sort of drives, I suppose, systematic change within people's behaviors. So some people were maybe looking to speculate more with what money they had to try and make ends meet. Others perhaps were more easily turned into mule accounts and offered the fraudsters the ability to kind of wash funds through more easily. So there's a lot that happened, and some of it, and I think the scale overtook a couple of banks maybe. But then we've seen off of the back of the Which Super complaint, that the bringing together of the contingent reimbursement model, banks are now much more alive in terms of sort of dealing with the end-to-end of losses. So the kind of code requires certain things of both the sender and the receiver banks. So we're really sort of squeezing in on all the different points of detection, all the areas in which we can try to sort of reduce losses. The cross-industry collaboration has been, again, growing over the period of time. Again, businesses were impacted by the remote working and what have you. But it's, I suppose, that as happens, fraudsters react to us, we react to them. I would hope last year, although, as I say, I suspect instances have gone up and losses have possibly gone up. But I think the significant growth that we saw, so where, as I say, was sort of 90% plus of volume, I would hope we kind of put a bit of a lid on that, and then we can bring it down. But again, there's a lot of educating of people that needs to happen to kind of really deal with this. So it's not a fast thing, and obviously, as providers of financial services, equally, we don't have the liberty to just block all transactions, to have very long, in-depth conversations with customers. We've got a need to service people quickly and efficiently, and that drives limitations in terms of what we can stand in front of, and how, as best we try. There are conversations you can listen to where agents they've literally spent 25 minutes trying to convince someone you are being scammed. We've had, as other banks will have had, members of the public will literally be in branch, the police will come in to speak to them and still absolutely convinced it's genuine. So it's, some of it is really, really well engineered, and arguably, as tends to have happened now over the last sort of 6 years, the fraudsters and the scammers, this is an industrialized business. They are not the sketchy people working out of mum and dad's basement or in some dark corner. They have made a business out of this. They are very good at doing what they do. Their social engineering is very good. In fact, arguably, and we have looked at some of the way in which they look to kind of use emotion to engineer customers into doing certain things. We're trying to learn from how they're convincing customers to do what they shouldn't, to try and convince customers to do what they should. So it's been interesting, but yeah, there's been an awful lot of focus from the industry. So I'm hopeful the numbers reflect that.
Fantastic. Incidentally, we just had a question, which probably it's a good time to throw in, actually. So thank you. Interesting point around, so can customers be trained to assertively challenge impersonation and prevent it at source? So, obviously some of the examples you've given there, it's almost kind of baffling, but do you think there's a role there in terms of kind of fighting back using the customer?
I think so. I mean, we've got definitely, and some of it again is sort of cross industry. It's not necessarily just banks alone. So there's things like the Android call screening. So they've obviously awoken to the fact that there's a lot of spoof calls, and you can have Google screen calls on your behalf to make sure you're not getting the kind of the Amazon Prime scam calls and whatever else coming through to you. Network operators. So there's been significant issues with UK numbers that are routing through international sources, which a number of them have been on the front foot in terms of kind of stopping at source. But I think for those that come through, the Stop Scams UK group had launched the 159 service. So as much as we have things like the Take 5 campaign, where we encourage customers to sort of take 5, think about the request. Does that make sense? Is it normal? For not all, but for us certainly, and I know other banks too, you are encouraged to sort of put the phone down, dial 159 on your phone keypad, from which you will be asked which bank you wish to speak to, and it will be routed through to the bank. So it's a good way to make sure that you are speaking confidently to the bank. So I think we are still in a proof of concept phase with that, but there's certainly a volume of calls going through, and for customers who are in any doubt, I'm sure if you were to say to a scammer, how do I know you're NatWest, they will have all manner of ways in which you can be certain that it's NatWest. But if in doubt, I guess take those 5 minutes, call 159 and be connected to us, and we can check whether it was legitimate.
Yeah, nice. Right, there's a question coming, so I'm going to do this in 2 parts. If we could just move to the next slide, please, because it's kind of relevant with some of the things that we're talking around. So the headline is a bit provocative, if I'm being honest, but I think really the point is more to do with kind of up until this stage, a lot of the kind of mitigating procedures or kind of ideas around this has been mainly education and awareness. I think that can obviously take you so far. I mean, I'm just using examples of people I know, particularly some of the vulnerable people that will not have Twitter and various other things. And, it's not something that you'll regularly see on kind of national TV. So, I'd argue that there's some people out there that probably need the education more than most that's probably not getting access to it. But I think it's fair to say now, as we're getting into this new realm of collaboration, and we'll get into some of that in a second, that some of the technical mitigating factors and the data and the behavior is just improving all the time. So in fact, another question's just come in, so thanks for the questions. The second question's perfectly timed in terms of, so one for you, Chris. Why, and this could have been a conversation that's just not kicked off or whatever, or again, it's in embryonic stage, but why do you think there's not been a huge amount of effort to get this kind of APP fraud front and center, mainstream TV and radio and things like that? Or are we just missing it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think there definitely has been some advertisement that's looking to tackle it. So Lloyd's is one I always point to. So obviously they have a very sort of omnipresent feature of a horse in a lot of their advertisements, and I should be able to describe it better, but there was an advert which was on primetime TV. It was around football. It was on around key programming, which was basically a chap stroking a horse while a voiceover told them, "We will never ask to connect to your computer and for you to move funds." So, that was quite specifically targeting the impersonation attacks where remote access is sought. Barclays previously had been very good about advertisement, and even HSB. So I remember years and years ago when they released their card reader devices, there was an advert of a grandfather and a grandson sort of working with a lockbox trying to get access to money, and it was talking about how this thing is to keep you more secure. And I do think banks, and obviously certain banks weren't mentioned in those advertisements, could do more. It's obviously, again, questions of how many people are in front of TVs or traditional media, but I think we need to think about touching all points, and actually maybe not as individuals. We're all hurt by it. The likes of UK Finance, of Take 5, of Action Fraud, maybe need to be the front for campaigns that we push through, because we're all hit by broadly the same thing. So we should be sort of talking as one, because it's hurting everybody. It's hurting UK PLC, and there's actual harm falling upon people. So I do think we need to be more noisy about it. There's obviously in certain quarters been a lot of noise about the Which Super complaint and the bank's reactions to that. And I think that's all fair. But actually now when you see, or at least my perception of some reporting is we talk too much about the protection that sort of thing gives you. So I think one of the things that tends to drive, well, I was going to say normal people, that's entirely the wrong phrase. The majority of people to kind of behave in the right way is that feeling of jeopardy. You need to have a little bit of personal skin in the game for you to kind of take that moment, maybe interrupt what you were doing, slightly to think on it a bit more, and maybe return to it. A lot of the reporting is always about you guaranteed refund, you'll get your money back. And I think it sort of incentivizes perhaps a little bit of a overly laissez-faire attitude to some of it. I think there's any number of other things in life where you can see if you take away the jeopardy, people will do the wrong thing. So there absolutely needs to be the protection. Banks need to do their bit to protect consumers, but I think as well, it needs to be a little bit more, I think colleagues have described it as pleasurable friction, where people recognize why it isn't as easy as it maybe could be, but it's for their own good. And it's, we may be able to recover the money, we may be able to refund you the money, but actually typically that an amount of money has gone and it's gone into the hands of criminals who will then do other bad things that hurt other parts of society. So I think collectively we need to do more, and education through whatever means is a massive part of that.
Yeah, fair point. Right, we've still got questions flowing in, which is great, but I'm just going to move to, just go to the next slide, please, because I think this is really a good example of basically how not to handle it. We've done a great job, by the way, of masking who this is. I think everyone knows just from the font who it is. Obviously, and by the way, I need to just give a quick shout out to Lee Lambert, who sent me this, because I think it's as relevant as it gets. So just wanted to give you a brief example of kind of how, well, a bad example of really not how to handle it. And then the next slide, if we can just go to that, is, and this is blowing a bit of smoke up NatWest and yourself, Chris. So what we're demonstrating here really is just that, and we'll go into a bit more detail now in terms of the context, the data and the insight around individuals to tailor certain journeys and certain processes so that the vulnerable are catered for, or so that those that have maybe got a higher propensity to fall for these things are, the hand is being held, if you like. I think this really gives a good example of being a bit more proactive and being a bit more tailored around, okay, just be conscious of what you're doing, and just, touching on a bit like the Take 5 thing of just be aware of the fact that you're about to basically send money or whatever it may be. So I think that's a good kind of leeway into kind of a bit more of an open discussion now. So if we can just move to the next slide. Preempting the discussion points, I'm going to literally just throw two questions, which might be slightly disjointed, but I'm going to do it anyway because I think they're really good questions. So first question from the audience is, what enhancements, if any, do you think could be made in terms of recovery of funds? So the nature of these types of fraud is that the money moves quickly and naturally is hard to chase. Are there things within the industry like standards that should be knocked down so that banks can talk quicker and easier to each other? So kind of fostering, I guess, that even better collaboration.
Okay, sorry, I was waiting for the second question. Yeah.
I'll give you that. That's, or in fact, we've got 5 questions. They're all flying in now, so we might as well forget the slides. Anyway, sorry, carry on. If you could answer that one first.
Yeah, I think there is, and I really should remember what the acronym stands for, because one of my team does a lot of great work with members to do this. So I think we absolutely are developing, the interaction between banks. So obviously, you've got your kind of traditional brick and mortar banks. There's a lot now of the sort of the fintechs and others who are along for the ride now in terms of having victims and also being the recipients of funds. So UK Finance and others have started to build technology that is connecting banks and is assisting us in managing in some semi-automated ways and some other less automated, but nonetheless definitely more connected means to kind of manage recoveries and repatriation of funds and alerting recipients to the fact that fraudulent funds has gone to their account. So compared to what probably would have been, 7-8 years ago, where banks were literally exchanging checks to repatriate money, it's night and day. The money does move very quickly, as we're sort of posing the question. So, as money moves from maybe ourselves to another bank, it is a race to get there before the fraudster cashes it out or moves it on again. And there is, as I say, through groups like UK Finance, they are bringing banks together, and there is now becoming a standard in terms of how you can sort of interact, and that has improved things. And the key focus on repatriation rates, refund rates, and obviously that all helps the customer. So it's getting better. It's not perfect, but it's definitely getting better.
Which brings us on, right, so the next question, if I could just move to the next slide, which you've already done, so I'll shut up. So this lovingly ties into the first point. So when we prep for these things, incidentally, we typically just have a brief chat around some of the themes and stuff. So what we're going to do here is we've got 5 points that I'm going to kind of set the scene for Chris, and Chris is going to explain some of the things that they've been working on and some of the timelines and some of the value that's been attributed. But the first of those points is kind of better use of data, including the bank data themselves, which I think is a kind of bone of contention generally across the banking industry, that if anything, banks probably know most about anybody, and I'm including telcos, which is something that we obviously work heavily with. The number of transactions and things that are moving around. It's kind of, in fact, the bank probably knows more than your own family. So that combined with the question that I've just been asked. So in terms of utilizing your own data, and also those customers that you could argue maybe are not as digitally engaged, so let's class them, I'm just going to class them as vulnerable, whether that's accurate or not. How are you leveraging your own data, or the external data, and also how can you provide the same level of trust when they're not maybe as digitally engaged? Three-parter.
Good set of questions, yeah. So I think in terms of leveraging internal data, we're definitely on a journey within NatWest in terms of the infrastructure and the data. And for those that were there at the beginning will know that I kind of product own the infrastructure, data and authentication sort of focus of work. So it's kind of beholden upon me to work with our peers in data and analytics and really try to deliver the kind of architecture and data position of the future rather than what we have at the minute. So we're kind of on that journey, and we have done some things. So one of the bits that's been really interesting, and actually you saw the output of it earlier on in the slide deck, was around victim propensity. So we've actually done a machine learning exercise where we've looked at the unfortunate victims of APP impersonation attacks. So we've taken a period of time, looked at those victims, and then modeled across them to understand actually, are there any data features that would typically appear that are indicative of somebody having a higher or a lower propensity to be a victim. And we found 25 different data features that actually would seem to very strongly suggest somebody having had a higher probability of being a victim maybe in the future of an impersonation attack. So what we've done, having sort of done that exercise, is then look to see the following quarter, because with these models, you can't just go straight to kind of production. There's a lot of models risk assessment and sort of bias and efficacy you need to figure out. So whilst we were doing a lot of that, we were understanding of our next few months of cases, actually was that predictive? And it turned out actually it was, really quite good. So one of the kind of changes that we're trying to engender is that the minute, I would say banks probably are very good at detecting fraud or detecting scams. One of the things we need to be better at is preventing it, to trying to step higher up the sort of the chain of events to make sure that people such as those who we believe are at highest risk are engaged early. So the images you saw, so those customers who are assessed as having a higher propensity that also happen to be digitally active, they will now see targeted messaging that will deal with the exact authorized push payment theme that we think they're most at risk at. So we're trying to ensure they know what an impersonation scam is before the fraudster phones them, and in doing so, hopefully bring that kind of propensity to be a victim down and help them to protect themselves. And if they can protect themselves, there won't be a case for us to work, there won't be a conversation to be had. So that means we can then focus on those customers who remain kind of at risk and as victims. In terms of the non-digital, so we certainly are looking again at those people who have high propensity. If you are high risk, we will engage with you separately. So I think our wealth brand has actually pushed out fairly recently a very, if you like, old school alert. So it's literally kind of comes in an accompanying letter, but it is almost like a red card that has all the details of the scams that customers are currently falling victim to, the kind of attacks that are being tried. And it was a very, very kind of in your face, as I say, if you like, old fashioned paper-based letter in the post to say, be aware of these things. So we're definitely trying to be cognizant that not all customers are digitally active, not all victims are victims only in the digital domain. And again, where we step through, so we've got intent to go through the other APP thematics to try and see again, is there a way we can be predictive? Can we support those customers who need the support most? Because again, one of the issues we have is that if you have standardized warning messages, so every time you go in and make a new payment, you see the same warnings over and over again, whether you're paying your mum or whether you're paying someone you've met on the street, it's the same warnings, and you just become tired of it and blind to it.
Yeah.
What we do now is have within our web channel and soon to be in our mobile channel, bespoke messaging. So if we think that what you're doing is perhaps an impersonation scam or it's an investment scam, we will drive specific questions to you that are pertinent to what you're doing at that time. And you will only see them in the instances when we think you are falling victim to an attack. So again, it's less frequent, but when it happens, hopefully you're a bit more alert to it. You take it in, you consider it. So yeah, we're trying to kind of cover lots of bases. For those who are sort of contacted outside of, so the mobile app, in where you're using telephones, I mean, landlines with caller displays, unfortunately, spoofing is a feature, not a flaw in the telecom sort of system. So again, it's trying to reach those people and educate them that you just cannot trust the numbers. As I said before, we've essentially made all of our outbound calling from unrecognized, sometimes literally withheld numbers, so that we deny fraudsters the ability to pretend to be us, but they pretend to be other parties. So it's a challenge, but yeah, we're trying to cover the whole spectrum.
And this is a bit of a leading question, to be fair, but it's obviously, you talked about your own internal data, insights, etc. So I know obviously you work with us in terms of what we can provide from other sources, but are there any kind of focuses, would you say, from a third party perspective?
Yeah, definitely. As you say, somewhat linked and perhaps featuring on the next slide, we have so there's definitely work, I mean, in various forms. So definitely, as I touched on earlier, cross industry collaboration is much improved, and we're seeing the tech sector have woken up to it. We're now having conversations with Google, with Microsoft, with Meta and others to try and see how do we do more in their ecosystems, how do we protect their customers and our customers. But obviously, as we've sort of touched on with the phone calls and the spoofing, also with the SMS, the telco industry plays a huge part as well. And although it isn't necessarily a given, the investment scams typically include phone calls. The impersonation scams certainly include phone calls. So we've been doing a lot of work with telcos and with yourselves and Vodafone specifically to look at the data that they hold. And again, it's trying to change the conversation that we have re data. So if it's external data, we're really looking for data points and insights that is in the possession of others. So as we mature and as we have a greater capability to model our own data, we actually can sort of cover that. We don't necessarily need a third party to take our data or our customers' data and model it on our behalf. But where you are a telco and you are connecting calls, you understand, is this call abnormally long? Has it come from a line that either is a bank's line who perhaps haven't delivered something like do not originate? Is it calling the customer at a strange time of day? Have they kind of phoned this number or received a phone call from this number in the last 90 days? All those sorts of things become quite rich and insightful. And as it has done with things like and I wonder what I should call it, number verify, where we have delivered the capability through yourselves in our mobile app to strongly prove possession of a device without having to send the customer an SMS OTP, because actually it's all too easy for a fraudster to ask the customer for that OTP and they hand it over, and then we kind of lose any real proof of possession. Things like the SIM swap checks, again, where we are engaging with customers through SMS or through phone calls to mobiles, we can do a check and try and build some trust in. So yeah, we're very much, with frankly, whomever holds data that when maybe used in isolation or where combined with our internal awareness, it becomes really powerful. If you were to look at customers who we think are at high risk of being a victim of an impersonation call, and we're able to discern that they've been on the phone for an hour at the same time in which they may be making a payment, those things together will become very informative. So yeah, we're very much looking to partner with network operators to undertake, proof of values or assessment to see, is there a better way that we can, with less false positives or less impact on genuine people, detect these scams? Because again, that's the real kicker with the authorized push payments, as if the losses and the impact to victims isn't bad enough, because they look so similar to normal customer activity, because it is the customer and it is their device. The kind of false positive rates can also be very high, so you're impacting people doing their genuine activities. So yeah, we're looking at a lot of ways in which we can sort of better protect and work collaboratively again across the industries.
Brilliant. Looking at some of the questions that are coming in and trying to work out whether I can shoehorn some of them in again, but let me just carry on with a couple of the points here. So from a behavioral perspective, is this kind of you looking at, I don't know, kind of different ways people, maybe emotion has taken over in terms of how they're processing a payment, where maybe they're more frantic because somebody's talking them through something? Is that kind of the patterns and the understandings that you're looking for, or are there other things that you can shed light on?
Yeah, I mean, some of it will be, I mean, we've worked with a number of providers of sort of behavioral biometrics. So again, it works much better in digital channels because that sort of gives you, I guess, greater visibility of kind of the customer. But yeah, we definitely see the presentation of kind of stress indicators. So you can see that if a customer is being coached and a fraudster is walking them through undertaking certain activity or spending a lot of time sort of trying to convince them to do a certain thing in a particular way, you see the delays as they move between pages. You sometimes will see even mouse movement, might be circling around whilst someone's just sitting there waiting and someone's talking away in their ear. So again, that isn't data that we have ourselves. So you bring in things in from an external party who can say, this customer is demonstrating an indicator of stress. Even how maybe you populate an account number field. If you're kind of having somebody read that to you and you're keying it in as they're reading it, the pattern of entry is different than, say, long memory recall or short memory recall. So again, all those sorts of indicators can help us almost kind of take that big fun of loads of people making loads of payments, because obviously clearly the vast majority of payments are genuine. So you're starting with that huge funnel and you're looking at different data indicators to try and get into a smaller and smaller group with as much fraud in it as possible. So yeah, we'll take within reason anything we can get really to try and help with that.
Cheers, thank you. Right, the next couple of points on this slide, I'm going to just cover myself because I think we've touched on them both. I think from kind of modern digital identity proving techniques, I'm just going to throw proof in there in terms of some of the stuff that you've already mentioned, Chris, around mobile auth as being, a strong method of establishing possession, and then you can start binding other things as we move further through the kind of banking processes, if you like. I think just on the vulnerable side, obviously we've touched on some of that, and I think the data and some of the modelling that you're doing, particularly within NatWest, is really interesting. Just on a personal point, I thought it was fascinating that I try my best to not spam the world on LinkedIn, but unfortunately I do from time to time. I told a story recently of my mother and father, who are both on the critically vulnerable list, who are trying to do the most basic of tasks via a phone call with a bank. And they couldn't get through the Q&A to establish that it was them or not. I was witnessing what was literally, a trembling mother and a father who has Parkinson's, thinking, I don't really know where to go from here. So hearing of, better uses of data, better contextual understanding of who the customer is and things like that, and collaboration as we move on to the next point, I think is monumentally critical, because we shouldn't be leaving people behind. Talking of collaboration, well, that was a segue and a half. One of the questions that we've been asked here, so I'm just going to start with this, conscious of time. Is there much collaboration that's going on? There's two questions actually here. So one, between the UK and banks outside of the UK. Secondly, are you hearing of much collaboration, or are you involved in much collaboration around money mules at the recipient bank?
Yeah, so in terms of international banks, there is collaboration. I would say, as a percentage, a lot of the money still moves internally within the UK. It's not going off to other international countries, albeit clearly it does, in instances go internationally. But I think from a scammer or fraudster's point of view, it looks more unusual to try and move it to a different country, because often, people aren't typically doing that. So we definitely see differing levels of engagement and support and responsiveness. So I think were it to shift to a much more international sort of footing, then there's an awful lot more that needs to be done. I mean, obviously, when you're talking globally rather than maybe 20 banks, it becomes a much bigger problem with a lot less sort of interoperable systems and processes. So yeah, here's hoping we don't see a big shift to international payments. In terms of the mules piece, so there definitely is. I mean, actually, banks increasingly talk about now fraud prevention not being a competitive sport. We're all looking to try and push back on the fraudsters, and probably what would happen is we'd all push them out of the UK to some other country. But you kind of often need to be careful, kind of those in glass houses, not to look at where all the money is destined to from our accounts and sort of suppose that Bank X has a mule problem and that must be reflective everywhere, because actually, were you to go to other banks, perhaps the majority of their money would come into NatWest. So what you quite often see now is banks where they do highlight an issue, will speak to that bank and try to figure out, has there been some sort of a weakness in their onboarding process? Is there something else that's going on? By telling you which accounts we're seeing, can you join some dots? So there's a lot more collaboration in terms of not just pointing and saying, oh, they've got a massive problem, we're going to have to start really restricting payments to those accounts. We try to help them locate those issues and address those issues, and then that sort of lessens the impact on us. And equally, CRM, again, because it has put that emphasis on recipient banks, it's incentivizing banks, across industry to be more awake to money coming in as well as just money going out. So yeah, that collaboration is definitely there, and it's sort of growing.
Brilliant. And in terms of collaboration, and I'm conscious of the time, there's one question I'm definitely not going to get round to answering, so we'll 100% not miss anybody off. But so if we could just go on to the next slide. So for me, this is a huge kind of positive message that the ability for some of these huge entities to work together and provide answers and data studies and various other things as quickly as we have is kind of testament to everybody that's involved. So we're going to talk specifically in the last kind of 5 minutes around what we've done around what we're going to call scam signals. So I'm not going to specifically call out exactly what it is, but I imagine a lot of people on the call will know. First of all, just so you understand where proofs are kind of sat at the moment. So we're connected to two of the major telcos in the UK, enabling signals that we can look at and assess in terms of value. So we're the first to connect to two. We're the first to actually be in a position where we're providing kind of live API connectivity with Vodafone on behalf of NatWest. So it's been an incredible kind of ride, unbelievably quick in terms of how things have been turned around. But I want to throw it back to you, Chris. So we're in a situation now where we have some form of capability that we're testing. Can you give us, in about 2 or 3 minutes, kind of how it started, where we are, and any insights that you've got around APP and some of the scam signal work that we're doing?
I'll give it a good go. So yeah, as I think you said, as a prior employee of the GSMA, so to give them fair credit, as I will with the others, that they came to the UK banks and said, that there is an opportunity to do some investigative work. Is anybody up for, having a crack at it, seeing if there's any opportunities? We put our hand up and then sort of stepped in with the GSMA, with UK Finance, with Vodafone, to sort of undertake an exercise to, again, try and smoke out insightful data. So we often look at other industries and think, well, they must have indicators that could help us to prevent this. Clearly, there's a number of services already that exist, that you can get to prove, and others that will inform you of, the number verify status, the SIM swaps, and so on. And as such, we, I think at the time, certainly with Vodafone, we're sort of the only UK bank who undertook an offline exercise to try to provision them with insights as to victims, their phone numbers, and allow Vodafone to do some internal analysis to see, are there, I suppose you could say, data features that are prominent. And in doing that, we learned quite a lot. So we learned that, yes, there were indicators. When you look at things like the length of the phone calls, I think it was an average fraudulent phone call was about 40 minutes. The payments tended to be made about 20 minutes into that phone call. elements around customer connectivity. Have they been phoned by that number before? So that became very interesting and would seem to provide opportunity to sort of receive insights and sort of data in near real time. So as you say, it was slowed down as best and possibly any banks can in terms of governance and sort of legalese, but ourselves, you improve Vodafone ThreatMetrics as well, who were supporting us, came together to basically very quickly integrate a straight through sort of capability for us to see something on our side that presented some risk or concern, and then from Vodafone understand from their side of the fence, did they see anything that was concerning to them, and to kind of bring those two things together and again try to identify fraud. So at the moment, I mean, we're very much in a proof of concept stage still. There's absolutely sort of green shoots of opportunity that are kind of presenting themselves. It's something where we're likely looking to sort of extend to sort of see more and see it for longer, and really try to build a picture of how much sort of trust or lack of trust we can devise through sort of spam and scam signals. And I think, seeing the questions on screen as well, in terms of the collaboration, it isn't yet resulting in reduced loss in terms of what we're doing, but we can definitely see opportunity where actually the telco industry can help us reduce the losses. Some of the things they're doing with the SMS firewalls, again, could be a rich signal. Customer X has received a suspicious text message or a text message that was later confirmed as fraudulent. So all those sorts of things will help us identify those people who could be at risk. And yeah, so it's really good. We look to do more. We'll be trying to find ways, and kind of I noted a question as well about outbound sort of preemptive education. I think the more we are looking to identify the indicators of possible threat, then yes, we do need to find those ways where we can proactively make calls. So I think our deployment will be that we'll look to give insight through the app. So probably not through push messaging, which you could do, but actually you receive a push message to say the bank is trying to contact you, and then you're driven through self-authentication. You then come through to the bank, and that delivers that mutual authentication. But yeah, I mean, the work, as I say, that we prove Voda and ThreatMetrics are doing is really interesting. I guess we all hope that it's going to be a real sort of paradigm shift in terms of our ability to push back. It's early days, but there's, as I say, definite green shoots of success. So here's hoping.
Thanks, Chris. That's brilliant. I'm really conscious that we've run out of time. So 2 last things. One, a huge thank you for everyone who's asked any questions. Really appreciate it, really engaging, brilliant. Any other questions, feel free to throw them over. The last element, we are open to do this with more and more, whether it's banks, cryptos, or anybody else for that matter. We're more than happy to extend this. So working with, in particular, the likes of Vodafone and O2 now, we're keen to see where the value is. So please don't hesitate to contact. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody else. And we'll catch you soon. Take care.